I am from the 33rd Common. I love the journey, I love civil services. I love the fact that, especially for me being a woman coming from a middle class family, I think the kind of exposure you get, the kind of understanding of the real Pakistan you get outside of our MM alams and our fortress and whatever, you realize that there's a Pakistan out there which gives you fertility of mind, which is amazing. It's absolutely amazing and fascinating to see the real Pakistan. And I think civil services allowed me that exposure. It allowed me to travel to Gwadar and to KP and to Torkham and to debate with people who thought they knew what they were talking about. And at times, thanks to Sir Umar, because I think he encouraged all of us, we were able to debate with such people. I was able to see, there's patriarchy at home, but then I was able to see patriarchy in the field. I was able to see how service is thought to be implemented and how it is actually implemented. And so I think, this is like the best time ever, especially when you're in training. I think there's nothing like it because you're free to do and be who you are. And so, that's my words of wisdom, be who you are. And then, so I did that. I was slightly frustrated because I think I had joined the civil service, like I said, naively, I guess. I joined the civil service thinking that I could make like an underground difference. I think I did make a little bit of difference, but it was so not systematic that it really frustrated me. But at the same time, given that you see the real world, you see institutions as they are, it was a totally, it made my mind totally fertile. Lots of questions, no answers, right? And so I decided to, I thought maybe education would help. So I decided to join a public policy program. But unfortunately, power asymmetry exists and, everything, even education is a result of some power relation somewhere. So when I went to the UK to study public policy, I see that most of it is taught through, there's like this top-down lens from a white man's perspective. And it was quite frustrating because I thought I'd go there and debate with the best minds of the world, people from Africa who experienced probably similar institutions, and we could, figure out and come to a solution about how we address issues, how do we help people. It really was not like that. It was people who were, trying to become investment bankers basically, but doing a public policy because it was a good, quick fix towards that. So anyway, so I moved towards economics. I did an MSc economics from LSE. I then moved to Cambridge University. There was a mutual dislike, and so then I moved back to LSE. And so I've done my PhD from LSE in 2019. It was exciting, it was intense, but anyway, if anyone ever wants to pursue higher education, I'm there, so please reach out. And yeah, so I do research now. I try and think about the issues that I've always thought about by, I have the luxury of reading, and that's my job, and writing, which is amazing. I get to debate with the best minds in the world, and so I'm living the best life ever, okay? And so I'm an assistant professor now of economics at the University of Virginia. I teach development economics. I'm interested in questions of political economy. I think anything development related is a question of political economy. I think this person sitting here is the exact opposite of what I just described. I can give a formal introduction. So let me just give you a one-liner formal introduction of Leonard. He is a James Madison Professor of Political Economy and Professor of Politics and International Relations at Princeton University, as well as an Associate Faculty in Economics. I don't think he needs, you can go read his bio on his website. This person is incredibly generous with his time. He is an activist who is research. He considers research as a means to an end. And the means to an end is to end poverty, to lift people out of relations where they feel trapped and they feel that they have no agency. And so all of his research, if you read his research, even before I met him, I've read his research. It's on voter relations, it's on how slave trade left people mistrusting others. It's about how people form beliefs, it's about political institutions. You name it, and things like there's a lesser known paper of his which is on critical junctures, which is about how the type of social movements you have will determine the kind of institutions you have later on. So for example, rural areas where things were more violent in Africa ended up having different institutions as compared to the urban, non-violent, movements that happened in Africa. So you pick up his CV, I think there is just an immense amount of things to learn. He is an activist to the, it's unusual to meet an academic like him because he had decided to change human capital in Africa and he set up the African School of Economics in 2014, where his idea is to generate like a world-class institution within Africa where you're generating human capital of the sort that will be sought after by the world. Because to be honest, when I was in LSE, there is research that gets done, there are conversations that happen about us and we get left out. We never contribute to that debate, right? And so putting the South back on the table to have those debates it's phenomenal. Right? And to have an academic that has that viewpoint, for people like me who are juniors, it's just so encouraging, right? Because we are taught to not waste our time, don't talk to policymakers, just don't engage, get your research, get out. Right? And he is just the opposite of that, extremely generous person. Anything he does is about making sure it's representative, everybody's included, we have conversations where everyone is listened, he's democratic in the way he does things. And so, I can give you his laurels, if we have, I don't know if we have tea afterwards, but we probably should because his story is, the story from Benin to a professor sitting here is fantastic. And over to you.
Thank you. I feel so lucky that having been to this country for less than a week, I was able to meet not only a lot of professors, alums, talk to a lot of students, but also I was able to meet yesterday a former federal minister of social protection. And then today I have the opportunity to talk to the elite training center for public service, just within a week. I have never been here before, so it just confirmed my bias for Pakistanis. The hospitality, the open-mindedness is something that I've experienced for a long time. I have a lot of friends who are Pakistanis, and what I really liked is their open-mindedness. Like when you talk about Africa, it's always a negative light. And they are the one to say, well, the same thing in Pakistan. Whether this is true or not, it just makes you feel like you are in the same struggle and you are alive, which is very important. And anyway, so what I'm going to be talking about today, it's something that I hope you'll find inspiring for your future career. So I'll be talking about political economy, not as a drag, or politics in general, not as a drag on development, not something that we should be afraid of, something that we should resent, but politics should be something that we embrace. Politics should be something that we use to promote development. And this idea is not really new. As Shan has said, I have a very unique road to academia. First in the middle school, basically in 11th, 10th grade, I was one of the leading pro-democracy activists in the country. I said 10th grade. I was very young. So, and when I started the university, I organized the first major student uprising against the military government. So I was expelled from the university and my pictures were everywhere. So I went to hiding for 5 years. And this is a picture of me in hiding. So you can see me on the far left with my other friends. So we are moving from one place to another every week. so that we could not be arrested. So those days, for me, it was about feeling strongly that development requires democracy. Development requires freedom, and the way you build a country is not just by training students and young people to become competent, it's also by getting them the space needed to thrive, And so clearly this was my most, for me at least, for those 5 years were the most formative of my life. So when, after these 5 years, I was allowed to come back to the university, and then we organized another major student uprising, and this time I was arrested and I spent 18 months in prison, and I managed to escape. So I escaped, and then I went to Nigeria, and then Cote d'Ivoire, and then I managed to find myself doing a PhD. So it's a long story, doing a PhD at Northwestern University. So when I started my PhD, the first thing in my mind is how I can use mathematics, economics, analysis to think about political mechanism of economic development. So the idea that we need to uncover the political mechanism of development and try to use politics to fix, to resolve development challenges is something which is clearly apparent in this first proposal that I wrote. This is the proposal that I wrote, and nobody was paying attention those days. If you read the comments, it's one professor who sent me another professor, who also sent me to another professor, because they didn't get what I was trying to do. But this didn't discourage me, because I managed to actually write a thesis based on this work and end up at Yale University. In fact, because I was so passionate about the topic, I was so deeply emotionally involved in the topic, I finished the PhD in 2 years and 9 months, as opposed to 6 years for most students. So it just shows you that when your personal experience guides your work, when you develop a passion for what you are doing, you can, miracles are possible, and this is clearly one of them. So after I got my job at Yale University, I came across, first of all, because I was not trained political scientist. So when I started, I read ferociously everything about political science. So I came across political philosophy, and I was really struck by this quote by Immanuel Kant that really confirmed my prior inclination for how we should study political economy. So, in his view, political scientists should be focused on trying to find good politicians who will change the world, who will make things better. Political science should be about think creatively on a system that force politicians, even if they are devils, to do the right thing. Because he thinks that a republic can be created by a race of devils, so long as they have intelligence. It means that we create constitutions and we create a framework, we create a set of institutions. This can mold, this can force, this can get any type of politician to act cooperatively as opposed to self-destructively. So we as intellectuals, we as political scientists in particular, we have an important responsibility. It's not simply to describe how bad things are. It's not just to describe who is good, who is bad. It's to think creatively, forcefully about what can be done to make almost any politician to do the right thing. So, what I'm going to be talking about today, it will be in 4 steps. The first step is to link basic development principles to political economy and to define what I will call political distortion, and then to jump straight into how you fix development challenges with politics. There will be 2 sets of ideas. The first one will be around what I call public management political selection. So how can you reform government structure? How can you improve institutions in government to promote development? And also, how can you select? Are there principles, are there institutions that you can put in place that help you select better politicians as opposed to worse politicians? And then later on, I'm going to talk about how you can deepen democracy by promoting citizens' participation, citizen engagement, through what I would call public reason, which is basically that policymakers that you are going to be, if you are not already, should put pressure on themselves to explain, to persuade on law and policies that they enact, with the assumption that reasonable people, when in this process, will agree that this is the right policy and mobilize, stimulate not only participation but also investment from citizens, because policy is, whether we like it or not, is always co-created. Because when you deal with policy at the top, somebody has to be implementing that at lower level, and they bring their own energy, they bring their own ideas. So the policy that in fact end up being enacted is a version of what has been decided at an earlier stage. So citizens' involvement, citizen participation, what I would call public reason, is an important principle of policy making that I'm going to be discussing. Okay, so in economics is now a fact that productivity drives divergence in welfare. So GDP, social welfare across countries are driven by differences. The differences in living standards and welfare are driven by differences in productivity, in total factor productivity. So it's not simply driven by capital, education, human capital, is driven by the social infrastructure that help mold capital and labor. And development is when those factors, labor and capital, are properly allocated across regions, across sectors. So development happens when less productive sectors or more productive sectors send capital to the less productive sectors. When labor and capital flow freely from one sector to another, from one country to another. But then why this doesn't happen? Why you have persistence of low productivity in some sectors, in some countries? Why capital do not flow from one place to another? The key reason for that is problem of regulation, property rights, contract enforcement. But then property rights, contract enforcement, regulation, in short, political institutions, what I call the social political infrastructure. This is political. All those total factor productivity, as I explained, and I just described, it's basically political. It's about political institutions. So, because regulation, property right, contract enforcement, all this depends not only on how the bureaucracy is organized, it depends on how office holders are selected. It depends on how strong the enforcement of law that have been decided is. So, besides the strength of the states, besides the nature of political institution, you also have to deal with inequality. You have to make sure that the distribution of power in society is equal. But that also political, because decisions made through political institutions, for instance, will disempower some groups and empower others. So now, to be able to think creatively about how to promote development, then you need to have a clear sense of what institutions ought to be, and then how to be able to describe what the institutions are, and look at the gap between the two. The gap between the two is what we should call political distortion. So, for instance, to promote innovation, you need market competition. In a situation where, because of political connection, some firms were able to get monopoly because they bribe some bureaucrats, or because they pay campaign contribution for some politicians. This would be called distortion, political distortion. Because market competition is what is needed, but what we have is instead monopoly of a connected firm. I'm going to get back to that in a second. We need, for instance, to promote development, we need public investment. We need some optimal level of infrastructure investment. road construction, road maintenance. But if, because a politician wanting to win the election, build roads in places where he or she can win votes, as opposed to places where road and investment in road will improve economic development in the country as a whole, that's also political distortion. So when investment is used for political purposes, as opposed to for economic development, that's also political distortion. So I'm going to call the first type of political distortion firm-induced distortion, and call the one I will describe later voter-induced distortion. Okay. So now, the idea we have usually is that, well, the optimal policy that will promote development can be decided by a benevolent dictator, somebody who has the interests of the country at heart and make all the decisions. But in reality, there is no such thing as a benevolent dictator. So all politicians want to private interest or personal interest. And as a result, institutions have to be in place to induce them to make good choices that will promote development. Okay? So there are a lot of ideas, I'm not going to go through the detail, but what I would like you to see is simple, which is that we need a framework where we have a set of what we think as optimal institutions, growth, development promoting institutions, and then we also have observation about real institutions, and we look at the gap between what things are and what things ought to be, and this gap is what we will define as political distortion. And when we define and measure political distortion, later on, we need to understand the mechanism of how this distortion affects, drive underdevelopment. And knowing the mechanism, we can do something to reduce it. Okay. So, the first form of distortion that exists is lack of democracy. Why autocracy, dictatorships, military rule is distortionary? It's distortionary for one fundamental reason, is uncertainty. Like, what is good about a democracy is that there are clear, well-accepted principles for turnover in government. Why under dictatorship, there is no such certainty. It's government change either because of violent conflict, because of a coup, or so there is no clear mechanism for turnover in office. And this uncertainty is one of the reasons why, even if at the beginning some dictatorship generates a lot of development, a lot of investment, in the long term it declines because investors are afraid of uncertainties because they don't know exactly what tomorrow will be made of. Capital can come and go because of political uncertainty, because of instability. So the predictability of the way government change ends is one of the major advantages of a democratic system, and that's why non-democracies are inherently dysfunctional. The second type of institution that we can think of is the institution that generates public investment. So there is a classical paper written by Robert Barrow in 1990 where he looked at what should be, for instance, the optimal investment in roads. I'm not going to go through the detail, but what he finds is that politics and political preferences should not come in the way of this investment. But in reality, that's not the case. So this is a very good example. Kenya. So Kenya had a dictatorship from 1960 to 1970, and a democracy from 1960 to 1970, and again from 1990 to 2010, and dictatorship from 1970 to 1990. And you can see that what we have here is the gap in road maintenance expenditure in districts that are from the same ethnic group as the president, and the districts that are not, where the majority of people living there are not from the same ethnic group as the president. And under democracy, you see the gap being relatively small. Under dictatorship, the gap is very, very big. So it shows that in itself, democracy allocates public investment more productively than dictatorship, at least in the context of Kenya. Now, democracy doesn't always work properly because voters, particularly in the rural areas, sometimes might be dependent on politicians. Like there is a great paper by Salim Ek that came out last year showing that in Pakistan, many politicians are landlords, and because of the tenancy system, peasants are basically forced to vote for them because they are going to lose income, they are going to lose their means of, they are going to lose income, they are going to fall into deep poverty if they don't vote for the landlord. And this structural dependency of voters to politicians will weaken accountability because you are not voting for the candidate based on what he or she has done. You are voting because if you don't, he or she will know and you are going to lose your income. And she shows that improvement in agricultural productivity in rural Pakistan weakens those paternalistic ties between peasants and voters and lead to them voting for opposition candidates or voting for candidates who are not landlords. So this is an example, for instance, of democracy failing to produce development because of clientelist ties. Here it's clientelism that weakened democracy. Before it was ethnicity, ethnic ties between politicians and voters that weaken the political system, even though democracy works better than autocracy. All right. Now, the first part I just described is what I would call voter-induced distortion. It's the relationship between politicians and voters that induce distortion that will weaken development prospects. Now, what about firms? So there is a model of innovation, technological innovation in particular, that shows that technology innovation happens when you have competition between firms to capture the markets. Now, what if one of those firms is linked to the political process, has political connection? So, what's going to happen then is a situation where his market share will not be decided by innovation, but will be decided by political connection. For instance, you might have a situation where the government puts more higher tax burden on or give favors to connected firms, and as a result, give that firm market advantage. And in this context, we find that if there is a well-functioning democracy, then this political connection will not lead to, this political connection will not affect market competition, because you have a challenger, you have another political party that's vying for political office that can threaten to remove the incumbent, and this will help sort of reduce, promote market competition. So there is a correlation between political competition in the political space, and competition in the marketplace. And there are several papers that show that one way to, in fact, reduce firm-induced distortion is through well-functioning democracy. There is a classic paper that illustrates very well how political connection, for instance, is detrimental to growth in Pakistan. So, Atif Mian and Asim Quasha from Harvard have studied political connection of banks, public banks in Pakistan. And we find that the firm that have politician as a board member receive 42% larger loans, even though they have 50% higher default rates. And this happened not in private banks, but in public banks. What is also very interesting is that this preferential treatment increases with political strength. So when you are very strong politically, you get more advantages from public banks. So what is also fascinating about the paper is that they measure the cost of this political distortion, and they find that we have anywhere from 0.15 to 0.3 loss in GDP as a result of just this political connection in the public bank sector. And the higher estimate is up to 1.6%. So, it just shows you how detrimental firm-induced distortion can be to growth. All right, besides distortion coming from voters, distortion coming from, induced by politicians wanting to win the election by giving favors to voters, or then wanting to win by being connected to firms. There is also other theoretical model talk about how lack of representation of groups is also distortionary. A situation where women are not represented in governments or minority groups are not represented in government is also distortionary. The inequality distortionary, and also the lack of enforcement and well-functioning legal system is also distortionary. So anyway, the general point I wanted to make first is to really understand that we have to have a clear sense. We need to work at connecting this distortion to development, like what was done in the work I just presented, where they show that favoritism in the banking sector, particularly the banks that are connected to politicians, leads to 1.6 can lead to 1.6 loss in GDP per capita. Okay, now let's move to how you can reduce distortion. I will consider two broad categories. The first would be public management. So this is directly relevant to your work because we are talking about reform in the public sector. And the second one will be selection of politicians and bureaucrats. Laws that enable politicians, good politicians and good bureaucrats to emerge. All right, so there are a number of avenues. One is to limit lobbying by providing state funding of elections. There is some support for that because one of the drivers of corruption in the political process is when you allow, for instance, firms to fund campaigns, and it's when, for instance, you also allow politicians to buy votes. On the public management side, increased transparency has been shown to be effective. There are ways that you can digitize, for instance, tax collection. You can audit contracts. I'm talking about public contracts, particularly procurement. You can also leverage technology to enable funds sent to local citizens, like through social protection program or investment in school and clinics. There are ways you can make those transfer very transparent to some form of digitalization and ID cards, e-invoicing, and so on. So audits using technology and also reducing lobbying will be an effective way to improve public management and reduce political distortion. Now, the second part is what I call improving the selection of bureaucrats and politicians. So, one way you can improve selection is by giving more information to voters. By making sure that, for instance, information about the politicians and their past behavior is publicly known by voters when they are making choices. Unfortunately, this doesn't always work, because the information can be distorted, and people might use this information, for instance, to assume that every single politician is corrupt, and as a result, they don't go out to vote. What instead works is citizen engagement in political campaign. So I've done several work, for instance, in which I show that when information provided to voters come from town hall meetings, come from, not one-way communication during campaigns, but multilateral communication strategies, town hall meeting in particular, that this can make voters more engaged and can also enable politicians who are more competent, politicians who are more public service motivated to emerge. Other works have shown, for instance, that gender quota help to select good candidates because male candidates, when they have gender quota, will like, for instance, to competing with women, for instance, might make them raise their credential. Will make you are making the pool of candidates more competent by inducing competition. And the competition, for instance, in this space is induced by guaranteeing some spots for female candidates. Others have shown, for instance, that when candidates are selected through primaries, when primaries are open, when the way you engage in politics is not behind closed door, it's public, it's through a public forum, you have tendency to have better quality candidate emerging. Now, the second type of the second strategy to reduce distortion is what I will call public reason. Before I talk about public reason, let me summarize some key points here. The first one is that, from what I said so far, development requires institutions that are inclusive and open. You need institutions that get people to mobilize towards common goals. Deliberation, discussions, engagements are means to achieve those goals. And you also need voters, politicians, bureaucrats to have joint ownership of the decision. Now, the way you do this is through some set of institutions that you can put in place. The question is, how do you evaluate those institutions? Like, for instance, if you want to improve education, I'm going to give that example. I'm going to go through a specific example in a second. Do you want decision about education priorities? Do you want to put this solely in the hand of the Ministry of Education, that will simply inform the school about what they will be doing? Or, for instance, do you want the different stakeholders, whether they are parents, whether they are religious leaders, teachers, involved? How do you do it? So policy making is not about what policy needs to be implemented. Policy making should be about how those policies are implemented. And there are a lot of techniques today to measure the what, but not enough the how. And the how can be as important as the what. Well, assume that the policy is controversial, that some people benefit from the policy, some people benefit less. So the policy will generate a conflict. You can reduce the conflict by improving participation, because everyone involved will feel like their voice has been heard, that the policy has been co-produced, and therefore is their policy as much as it's the policy by the bureaucracy or by the government. So, and also, when a policy is co-produced, it tends to be more transparent. People will know the inputs, they will know the resources that have been used to generate the policy, and this transparency alone can actually reduce conflict and improve satisfaction. Something which is also important is not just the buy-in, it's also investment by local communities. The enactment of the policy not only might depend on how much money, how much resources the government put in, it also might depend on resources that will be mobilized locally. But this is more likely, this is going to be more likely, for instance, if people are part of the decision making. So so what I'm saying is that one exercise that I would like to see more and more in public administration is not only thinking about a set of policies that should be enacted, but to think about and to measure, to look at the impact of a specific way this policy will be enacted. And the way you do it is by, for instance, assigning some districts to a procedure, to a process, and other districts to a different set of process. Look at the outcome in the two and compare. And a more open, democratic, participative process, for instance, might be better overall, even if the policy is worse, because people attach some value, some intrinsic value to the process itself. People like the fact that the decision is not as good as we like, but at least I was asked to participate. I was asked to give my opinion. And so I just give this an example to tell you how process might matter and how it's really important that in public policy schools we not only teach how to write policy brief, how to design policy, but to think creatively about small or big reforms that we can put in place, not only to improve legitimacy of decision we make, to improve the sense of agency and empowerment of those affected by those decisions, so that we can get more information that will help improve the policy, but also we can get more investment in effort, in financial resources for the impact of the policy to be bigger. So I think from what I said so far, democracy is not enough. A good, well-functioning public administration is not enough. Technology is not enough. Citizen engagement, mobilizing the energy of ordinary people in the process of decision making, the process of implementation of decision, is something which I think is really, really essential. And unfortunately, this is something which is very, very rare. And to show how important this is, I did an exercise in Nigeria in the context of a project called RISE, Research, in improving the system of education. That is Rise Pakistan, Rise India, Rise Vietnam, Rise Nigeria. And I'm the PI of Rise Nigeria. Okay, here is what we did. So the goal here is to put the decision making in education in the hands of local stakeholders. And the process is the following. So first we gather information about what the issues are, the resources that are available. That's step number one. Step number two, what we did is we organized an education summit in several locations where I'm going to be more specific in what the summit means in a second. And then after that, we did something very powerful, which is we wrote the summary of what had been decided at this local summit, and we call it a social contract. And we look at the effect of this on learning outcome, investment in education by the community and by the government, and more importantly, the impact on ownership of those decisions, sense of ownership of decisions. Okay? So again, 3 steps. First step, before the summit, we have a systematic data collection, and we did surveys to have policy priorities. And then at the summit, we organize the dialogue. And then post-summit, we make sure that the contract, the social contract that we came up with, is something which is known, which is disseminated as largely as possible to create a bond between the different stakeholders in education. Okay? So here is what it is. So, for instance, this is some pictures of the summit, and this is here, me in the middle. So, because of because of the time difference, the 6 hours between Nigeria and Princeton, where I teach, I have to wake up at 3 a.m. and I didn't have to say much, but I wanted to I made sure that everybody, that people did not take me as, didn't take me as just a non-Nigerian, a foreigner. And I used the fact that the village where I was born in Benin in 17th century was actually set up by a Nigerian hunter who basically ended up in Benin, neighboring country, and set up the village. So I make sure that people know that I'm Nigerian, more or less. So if we were to do a similar project in Pakistan, I'll make sure that I'll exploit my friendship with Shan to say, well, I'm not 100 Pakistanis, but I'm getting there. So anyway, so it's important for people in an exercise like this for people to sense that you are not lecturing them, that you are really part of the community. So anyway, okay. So and here is the contract, a copy of the contract, and then after the contract, we have a meeting where with the states, with the representative from the Ministry of Education of the states, and we wrote a work plan. We provide a clear path for the implementation of the social contract. And then later on, we follow up with different stakeholders, not only talk about the priorities, talk about the discussion that we had, show the work plan, and also, So, as a result, I can tell you, preliminary results, that the education budget in the treatment places has more than doubled, and we have like a lot of local people from the region living elsewhere, people who are leading the region, providing desk, organizing to provide security for the schools, and being involved in the recruitment of teachers and so on and so forth. So the results of this exercise have been spectacular, So, and we are now going through a process to make this institution scale it up not only at the state level but also national level in Nigeria. So I use this to show how development requires institutional innovation of several types, and one of them is how you engage with local stakeholders. And the strategy we propose is one that we call Summit, Local Summit. Starting with data collection for people to understand what the issues are, a public debate, and then a clear work plan that you disseminate largely, as largely as possible, and so on. So it's hard to imagine a more democratic policy-making process than this. And it's something that you can do whether there is democracy at national level or not, because this seems quite natural. Mobilizing energy, mobilizing citizens at local level around issues that of great importance, like education, is something which is very natural. Okay, so to conclude, I say three things. So first, development is political. Not political in the sense of winning or losing election. It's political in the sense of political institutions. Like if the social, political infrastructure of the country through law enforcement, through contract enforcement, regulation, public investment, decides how efficient the country is in making human physical capital development promoted. And the second point I made is that when we talk about political economic issue, we always need to have a clear sense of what things ought to be. Like whether it's market competition, whether it's optimal public investment in roads, whether it's efficient law enforcement, whether it's equal distribution, fair representation of minorities. We need to have a set of principles. And then we need, when we describe the existing political institution, we need to make sure that it's about measuring the gap between the existing institutions and what those institutions ought to be. And this gap is what we need to call political distortion. And then when you know that there is distortion is driving underdevelopment, then you can think creatively about how to fix it, about how to reduce the distortion. And we think about, and we talk about three, we talk about public management, we talk about political selection, and then we also talk about public reason, citizen engagement and participation. So, and in this process, it's really important to develop a methodology that helps us measure the intrinsic value of the process itself. We need to think, we need to develop a sense that what we do has much value, how we do things has as much value as what we do. So we need to not only evaluate policies, we also need to evaluate ways the policies are implemented. And I just gave an example. And the view of political economy that I developed throughout this is view of political economy which is not just a constraint on development. The idea that we have this great development agenda and then the politicians are showing up to destroy it. We shouldn't be seeing politics as a constraint, as in reasons. We should see political economy as not only something which is essential, but something that should be a solution. So, but then for political economy to be a solution, we need to be creative, we need to be innovative. And the dimensions of this innovation is what I described so far. So what I hope that you will take away from this is that when you become civil servant, that you always think about policy design, but also think about some small changes, big changes you can make on how your office work, how your department work. To what extent you can bring the stakeholders in. Who should pick first? Who should pick second? How information should be disseminated. Those little things, in fact, can not only make your work far more effective and also promote a sense of ownership, a sense of empowerment and agency in the population, which overall help improve democracy, accountability in the country as a whole. Thank you very much.
How much time do we have? Just 15 minutes for questions? You're sort of, throughout the talk, there is some assumption about a Leonard that's out there that wants to implement the best policy, right? But you cannot, in my mind, it seems like the discussion on public reason is incomplete if we don't include the discussion on collective action and collective action failure and how you generate collective action. And so I would like to hear your thoughts on universities as that collective action producer, right? And within Pakistan, we've had a ban on political activity within universities. So how do we create more Leonards out there who care about public reason, who want to include people within public debate, right? And given the repression, given that universities, idealists within universities are not allowed to collectively come together and force people to have deliberation in policies. I think I would like to hear your thoughts on that. And just a very quick sort of conceptual thing. Something that's attracted me towards economics is market failure. And I think as I hear you speak about political distortions, it reminds me of market distortions. And I want to see how you think about the parallel between a market distortion that is devoid of any political, for example, information asymmetry, right? If you don't have information, so imagine a buyer and a seller. The buyer knows less, the seller of a used car will probably know more about their car than the buyer. So there is no government that can fix it, right? Because the information friction that exists in the market will exist with the government as well. So what role can a government play? Almost minimal. And so do you think that market distortions is like an umbrella concept within which political distortion plays a role, or like how do you see it?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to be very brief. So regarding the first point, I think we need all this to enter not only you guys, policymakers, so that when you do your work, you think of, like thinking creatively about how you get different stakeholders involved, how you co-produce with others. But it's also need to penetrate political parties so that they put on the agenda not just a laundry list of things that we need to do, but we also talk about how to do it. So we need to think about, okay, and NGOs and like political activists, when they talk to governments about a list of things that they want, they also need to demand small and or big institutional change. I remember when I was at the university, one of the boldest ways we manage to help fight corruption is by demanding that the University Audit Commission has a student representative. So we said, we are going on strike. There will be a lot of noise if we are not allowed to sit at the Audit Commission. And because we are there, there are things that used to be done that was not possible anymore. So, and it's very hard. For instance, there is no reason, there is absolutely no rationale of banning students from sitting at the Audit Commission of an university. Same thing here. It will be hard for people, for instance, it's hard to argue against banning politicians sitting on the board of banks. I mean, I'm not saying that people are going to agree on this right away, but if this is the foundation, this is the deep root of corruption, it's not just say, okay, so and so has plundered $200 million, blah blah blah. Yeah, of course. But if the deep roots of this is those political connections between firm and politician, and you understand that's what it is, make it what civil society organizations demand. Now, how do we get civil society mobilized? What are the collective action? How we solve it? I think it's a general problem. It's not just specific to this, but I agree with you entirely that for us to get this approach to work, we need this to be adopted by the government. But we can force their hand by demanding it, explaining why we need it, but also, we need to be convinced ourselves, everyone convinced that this is the right way, this is what we need. I was a political activist myself for a long time. One of the things that lacking in many social movements is you have a clear sense of purpose, but we don't always have the clearest ideas and specific suggestions and how we want things done. So that's all I can say. I think what we expect is that these changes, making political economy a solution, is something that will happen incrementally, at small level, at local level. Sometimes it will be done without permission, because if I'm a state governor and I said I want to bring people together to hear them before I enact an education policy, I don't think there is a law that will prevent me from getting people and listening to teachers, listening to whatever. So there are things that we can do. But then it's possible also to push to make this a law, to make it something systematic, to institutionalize it, and then build incrementally on this and then with a hope that there will be systemic change in the long term or medium term as a result of this process. Now, market distortion and it's possible that you can frame political distortion as distortion of political markets, and you have a big umbrella where part of the there is a big there is social distortion. Some are economic, purely market-based, and some are political. What I'm looking at here is the role that politics can play And I give a lot of examples, but I can think of a way. Let me put it this way: the economic distortion or the market distortion we talk about, it's something which is to some degree apolitical, because they involve individuals, they involve buyers and sellers, and so on. But when you have interactions between market forces and politics, you need to reduce the distortion in politics as much as possible to help markets to flourish and to develop. And I gave the example of firms that buy access and use their political connection to get taxes being raised on the competition so that they can capture, we can develop a monopoly as a result of competitive market process. So yes, so I'm talking specifically about political distortion, which could be seen under the bigger umbrella of social distortion. Every culture has the seeds of deliberation, citizen participation. There is a student from London who did, I forgot the name of the religious intellectual debate. Yeah, that's something which exists in Pakistan. And if you go to Africa, there are several institutions. Okay, so I don't buy the idea that involvement of stakeholders is something which might appear unnatural. In fact, you can design something that is inspired, that has foundation in the local culture and history. The form that citizen engagement can take might vary from one place to another. I don't also buy the idea that this is just a buzzword, because what I are talking about here is not just a concept. It's not a general idea of citizen engagement. It's a specific format that we use. Like every 3 months, bring people in, ask them questions, give them information, get them to debate for 3 hours, and after that, and make it even informal to answer the question about, it doesn't have to be formalized at first. It could be very informal, but critical, powerful, So I think that we need to see these institutions that will reduce distortion and discussing as something that can be both implemented informally or formally. But at least we need to have a clear sense of how important they are and the role they are going to play in changing economic process and decision-making process in the country. Now, there was a question about I forgot the last one.
Can you repeat your question? The lady in the back.
Yeah.
Selection of the bureaucrats.
Selection of bureaucrats. So that's a very, very important question. So the literature talked about meritocracy. It talked about contract incentives that can be used to get bureaucrats or career concern, like getting people to see that whatever they have done, how effective they have been in something that will help them. But you can think of a number of other things that you can do. I don't have a comprehensive list of things that you can do, but I think what you are doing is the best start. Like being, at a school, on a campus. But I think the point, and then get the highest level of training. But I think for me, what is critical is maybe to test the extent to which bureaucrats can be innovative and creative, and not only think of the institution of the state as given, but something that they can, to some degree, manipulate on the margin to achieve results. So I can say promoting creativity, innovation in the public sector, find a way to select the most creative, the most innovative, might be one way you can actually, one of the best way to select a bureaucrat, besides the entry exams or the normal process you have been going through.
Would be to SDGs, to education, to health, to rehabilitation, to the floods coming in Pakistan. And these are the young officers, they were there in the flooded areas for the last 2 months. So they have seen all things. And whatever you're saying down here, going to the community, going to the citizens, how to enable and co-produce, co-create, I think they have been covered as to that. And that's the reason why the first question was raised by Mr. Adisa. The real question, he needed time for that, so it needs a session to discuss. In our country, nothing works because the basic foundation and unit on which our society is based is not set. People don't have a consensus of what really forms us, how we have to behave. It is just ad hocism, just going through the motions. So the point is that the basic questions have to be answered. The basic superstructures, layers of contradictions have to be somehow answered in a society in order for any framework to move forward. Otherwise, anything can be raised theoretically, but down to the ground level, the basic units have not been set in a society. The basic discussions have not taken place. Maybe the answer could be total democracy, total inclusiveness, total open society, but it has not been done. So, at the cost of contradiction, at the cost of lots of debate, I can repeat Salman Rushdie's words again. Pakistan is a country insufficiently imagined. Please mark my words. Insufficiently imagined. We have to imagine it in the way we want it to be imagined. At least imagine, and then move forward. And then I would build on to, I already suggested my officers, they have read that as well, to read Mirdal again, Gunnar Mirdal again. So the concepts like cumulative causation, why resources don't move to the areas you were mentioning down here. So he exactly talks about those issues of equality, empowerment, education, population. Back in the 1970s, comparing India and Pakistan, how Green Revolution took on. So go back to the basics. You might start asking the questions again. And once you go on the first assignment, I would ask them and request them to mark the words said by Professor Leonard, which were think inside, think intrinsically, think inside your offices, inside yourself, inside your organizations. You might find the answers. If not the answers, you might raise new questions. I have nothing more to say on that. Professor Sir, such an honor for being here, for raising those questions, trying to get theory with practice, and I hope you are further confused there. They need to be further confused, and then I hope by the end of their careers or by the end of their life, they might try to find the answers. So if they find the answers, I would request them to come back to the academy and share that with the officers sitting where you are already sitting.